Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm David Mills, and I'm Treasurer of EASA, and I'm chairing this really important webinar today. And I'm going to invite up Marianne Jiveva and Martin Fotter onto stage, who are going to be presenting their report. So Rowan is going to help me bring people on stage. So while I'm waiting for them to come on,
I'm on.
Great.
I'm also change my. Yeah.
So before I introduce them, I'll just say a few words about this. I can go back 4 years to the Milan conference and a session that Maria and colleagues organised entitled. I think I'm looking back at the notes, Precanthro towards a transnational anthropological union, and this was a workshop that Maria, Teodora, Alice, Dimitra organised, which was very much about thinking about what was happening in the academy, the casualisation of academic labour, ways of organising, ways of bringing anthropologists together, thinking about some sort of transnational network and being positive. Lots of people came, and it was I think, a really vibrant event. And that led to a motion at the EASA AGM, which everyone supported, which was for EASA to sort of work on this building a collective platform. So what we're here today to do is to celebrate really 4 years of work that Maria and colleagues, especially Martin and Raluca, who are involved in carrying out this detailed analysis of the survey that they carried out in 2018, which has taken time and thought and care. And so now we have a really excellent report with lots of detail. So today's webinar is really a chance to discuss that, think about it. The way it's going to be organised is that Martin and Maria are going to present their findings, and for half an hour. Then we will have a chance for everyone in the audience to ask questions and think about some of the really important and interesting recommendations that come out of the report. So I'm really grateful to Maria and to Martin, to Raluca, also to Georgetta and Sabina, who were previous Precanthro representatives on the EASA committee, Valerius and Chelsea, who helped organise this initially as well. So there's lots of people who've been involved in this. This has been a real collective effort, and I think we should all be proud of ourselves. But I'm going to hand over to Maria and Martin. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to present this today. Like the way that we're gonna do this is that I open a bit, then Martin is gonna present the technical stuff, which he was more involved in, well, I was a bit more involved in the framing. And then we're gonna have a brief closing with some of the recommendations, which some of you already seen because they were published before the report appeared already on Monday. And we're gonna have a bit of a strategy discussion of where do we go next, and we really would like to hear your thoughts about this. So without further ado, how do I increase the report so that you see it? Can you make the slide central? Yeah. Do you see it as central now? Yeah. Okay. So, how do I scroll down? I can't. Okay, great. So first, we would like to say a few big thank yous to people that have been with us throughout, or in different periods, but in very strong support, to the Precanthro collective, but especially from them to Anna Ivashchuk and Dan Hirslund, who gave very valuable feedback, especially Anna, to Nomad IT, and especially to Rowan and Trino, because from the very beginning, the reason why Precanthro became a big event was that they understood the central importance of precarity within the profession and it being a growing trend, and the importance of the event becoming not just a marginal, like parallel panel or lab in the conference, but an actual lunchtime event with a horizontally structured room where we could actually have a dialogue. And it was great back then, but also very getting to see how many of you turned up. It was about 200 people. So we would like to say thank you to the EASA exec, so everybody who was on demo from 2016 till now, but especially to Thomas Eriksson, who came to that first event. He was one of the couple of senior faculty who made it and who really encouraged us to carry forward. And to Sarah Green, who has allowed us to continue with this effort and encouraged and enabled us as well during her mandate. To David, Mills, and Prem Rajaram, especially Kumar Rajaram, who have been very great with feedback and with all sorts of support during the preparation of the report. For Sabine Strasser and Georgetta Stoica, who also spent with us like a whole day, which they organized in Lisbon before the handing over of from one exec to another, to discuss which were the central questions that we're going to be asking in this report. Of course, the questions became many more, as you see, it is 100 pages, 102 pages. To Janine Widmer, who was with us in the beginning running the survey, and Rauka is not with us today, she's working, but obviously she's the co-author as well, and her analysis was absolutely, beyond our expectations, and she was really kind of the strong support for all questions and queries, and did a great job. To Andrew Hodge for his top-notch copy editing, and to Kristen L for her magical design and layout. To all of you, I guess it's mostly you precarious anthropologists who are here today, for the food of thought, for thought and spite that you gave us over the years to never stop struggling. And to our families and friends, because we brought anthropological precarity into their lives in so many ways. And now, how do I switch slide?
Maria, you just need to remember to say next slide, please, when you want to move on.
Next slide, please. As you see, the support has been absolutely vital and as well non-imposing. So a bit about the rationale for the survey, because there were a lot of questions that we asked that were not just coming out of a sudden, but were coming from a lot of research that has been done within our discipline, but outside our discipline as well, and has been documented in academic policy reports, as well as on a lot of more recently newspaper articles about academia as a whole, but also like what we try to do is also focus a bit more on anthropology, which will be even more the case in the next webinar, where we're going to be discussing authorship in big projects and how it affects anthropologists in specific. But here we were also trying to tackle issues around the growing division between research and teaching, which is very gendered often and utilized. The cyclical fundraising and work within big grants, the deprofessionalization of academic labor and multiplication of contracts, and the decreasing support, but increasing over time, that all of us face. And this is, as the report will show, completely across career ladder and ranks. The imperatives of institutional and interinstitutional and international mobility. And the more, I wouldn't say recent trend, but the realization that academic and other unions are weakened and not really able to get involved in a meaningful way in the light of precarious anthropologists, academic humans. The report captures trends as well as regional differences, so we had to be very specific about especially trans-European differences, because that's one of the strengths of EASA, being very mindful of that. And we had to notice that the report was, at least in its production parts, to a large extent produced by Eastern Europeans, So we're a Bulgarian, a Slovak, and a Romanian. The design was done by an Estonian. A lot of the comments were also by a Romanian, honorary Hungarian, and the top-notch editing by a honorary Croat. so I think even if we're just 9.7% of the sample of the study, Eastern Europeans, I think the contribution is clear and the divisions are still prevalent. And then this is known as the precarity report among us at the EASA exec, but it's actually a report that captures all career stages. And so I think a lot of you, even if you're not maybe already precarious or you've never been, you would still recognize yourself in some parts of this report. And now next slide, thank you. No, it doesn't work. It's not magic. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, so I'll take it from here. And what I would like to say, so I guess the first thing to note is that the graphs that you're going to see are prepared just for this presentation. In the report itself, we left mostly tables with raw data because we thought of it that we thought that maybe in the future people will want to explore some questions, and they can use it as a source. So the report is 102 pages long, and it could have been longer. I mean, we had this discussion of what to do with it. Like on the one hand, we had lots of data because the questionnaire itself had more than 30 questions, and you could analyze a lot of things from different perspectives. Break it down according to, I don't know, gender, academic position, and so on. On the other hand, you might need a shorter report. So we are preparing also a brief report, which would be more useful for maybe some quick overview and highlighting important issues. But at the same time, we were aware that it's a time-consuming work that should be done at some point. I mean, and it's very pioneering in some ways. I think of this continental size, EASA is probably the first union that has, first association that has such a report. And we realized that if we don't do the analysis now, although we have the data set, it's very unlikely that somebody will use it in the future. But maybe I want to highlight here that if somebody is interested in, for instance, developing some sort of an article or something in the future and would like to look at the data set, I mean, do approach us and EASA, and the data is there, so it would be a pity not to use it from some, if you're really interested in some other questions. Not for everything, and this is what I will get into. Not for everything we have enough data. We had 109 respondents from 59 countries. So you can imagine that, for instance, some country statistics are totally impossible. I don't know. From my native Slovakia, you have 3 people or 4 people. It's you cannot conclude anything from it. But it does report as a whole, and I'm going to lead you through few slides. The data as a whole, although it's not constructed squarely as a representative, as a strictly representative sample, does reflect more or less a situation within EASA, so it can be generalizable to EASA. We had a 35% response rate, which is normal for, or expected for internal reviews, surveys. In terms of gender composition, for instance, as you see, it's comparable to EASA. I mean, our survey also used one more possibility where people could specify how they prefer to self-describe, and there is about 0.5% of people who described in alternative and non-binary way, which is not captured yet in EASA, or I don't think EASA is now collecting data on gender, but in 2018 it was still possible to get it. As a result, and I just want to highlight, no harm is intended, but because precisely of the small issues, especially if you broke it down, let's say according to regions and countries or groups, we had to often merge the two categories at the end together, because we would get very small sample where we couldn't conclude anything, right? Okay, so you can, as you can see, we might say that possibly there are fewer men in our sample than in EASA, but it's a very insignificant difference, right? And more people who prefer not to disclose their gender. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of age composition, again, look at, survey is the blue bar. EASA in 2018 is the orange bar. As you can see, plus minus 3%, it very much copies, the curve copies the EASA curve. We are slightly, you might say, we are slightly on the side of early career researchers. So, 31 to let's say 40, it's about 43%, whereas in EASA it's about 40%. And if you add, so there might be a slight, and then if you extend it to 55, I think the difference rises to about 9%. But anyhow, it's a slight, so our sample is slightly skewed, probably, because of, and we cannot say, we can think why people self-selected themselves and answered the survey, answer to the survey, but we have no data on it. But we can assume that just because it's called, also because it's called precarity report and how it started, maybe there was a slightly bigger interest, higher interest among early career researchers. But otherwise, the curve more or less represents the EASA composition at the time. Next slide, please. And this is the same with countries. You have to actually go from the bottom. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to rearrange them. If you look at the top countries, Germany and United Kingdom, each one of them is around 15%. First three top countries, Germany, United Kingdom, stay the same. In fact, the first top 15 countries, they are the same as they are also the top 15 countries in our survey, as well as top 15 countries according to mailing addresses, what we have of the people in 2018. How you are registered on with EASA. So 15 countries didn't change. Top 3 countries didn't change. Again, there is a certain slight self-selection, and we can speculate why. So, for instance, United States, there were more members in 2018, and we than the proportion that responded to our survey. It is very probable that because it was a conference year, people became members to attend the conference, but otherwise did not, or weekly related to EASA. There is one interesting case is the case of Portugal, where Portugal was the fourth. It had the highest response rate from all countries, essentially. And again, we could maybe speculate, but these are just to highlight it. But otherwise, I would just want to say that the composition is more or less the same. 1/3 of EASA members and 1/3 of our survey sample comes from Italy. United Kingdom and Germany, which almost 1/3, about 30%. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of primary status, as you can see, most of the respondents thought of themselves as employed in academia. So that's the highest proportion. Then came doctoral students and people who were unemployed or employed outside academia. So this survey captures mostly academic anthropologists. As it's expected, because it was circulating among EASA members. So it captures the work and lives of or the situation of academic anthropologists who are working or active within academia. Okay. Next.
Maybe just one thing to mention here, as everything with the data set, it would be very interesting to make a study of specific groups and how they go through this. So for instance, a study of those employed outside of academia is on its own a project. That would be very interesting. But here we would be focusing more on the anthropological career in academia in Europe. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, and in terms of primary academic positions, so we asked the people, how would you describe yourself as a primary academic position? As you can see, more than a quarter are something at the level of postdoc, right? So postdoctoral researcher, research fellows, or similar type of positions. Then come. So it's if you see this line, it's more or less how you would imagine the pyramid to be at the university, or how would you recognize the pyramid at the university? Research fellows and postdocs, then lecturers, senior lecturers, or readers, and so associate professors, and then full professors.
But I think it's important to note that there are very few doctoral students, whereas the pyramid would ideally start with a lot of doctoral students. And this is, I guess, the indication which we're going to speak about later around funding and the ability to be a member of such an association, to pay your fees and to come to conference.
Right. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so So the whole survey has 10 parts, and there are 7 substantial parts, where we discuss mobility, workplaces, where we discuss contracts, where we discuss discrimination and various other issues. So do look at it. Right now, I'm not, we don't want to spend the whole day going through it. So I'm going to just give you some sense of some most probably, what the data which we thought at the moment to be most relevant. So as is expected, from our survey, we concluded that among respondents, and by extension probably among us as EASA members, fixed-term contracts were a norm. So 71% of all respondents held at least one fixed-term contract. Average duration of a fixed-term contract is 26.6 months. So there is and that is because and you'll see it in the survey, in the report itself. There is a high number of 6 months or below 1 year contracts, so probably some sort of teaching contracts or short-term research contracts, and then there is a relatively high proportion of 3-year contracts, which is potentially, I think, which is an emerging norm, I would say, especially within funding schemes of either doctoral students or postdocs. A lot of postdocs are probably now for 3 years. Among those who are employed in academia, if you remember that previous slide, so those 60%. So among those who thought of themselves as employed in academia, 49% were on fixed-term contracts. There were no differences in gender or along gender lines. So more or less, just as their fixed-term contracts were held in the same proportion as was the proportion itself in the sample, but there was a slight skewing when it comes to very short-term and very long-term contract, and that is potentially something which is probably very skewed, especially with regards to teaching contracts in Germany. If you remember, Germany was a big sample, and probably in German-speaking countries where a lot of teaching contracts are probably very short-term, and so 70% of contracts lasting 6 months or less, so for a semester, were held by women, whereas in the sample women were about 62.7% or something, so 63%. When it comes to very long-term contracts, so above 3 years, so above that emerging norm, again, only 48% were held by women, which means that men held disproportionately longer contracts. Probably, again, in some countries, these contracts which are for 6 years or whatever or 6 or 5 years. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so just this is in terms of this is percentage of fixed term contracts according to age, and as you would expect, as you get older, or as people get older and are longer in academia, I mean, either they drop out, so they wouldn't be in our sample, or then or you would eventually get the permanent contract. So you basically see that that there is a decrease. I mean, there is a slow decrease. So when you go from the let's ignore for the second below 30, which are probably many of them are probably students. But if you start somewhere at the age bracket 36 to 45, you have about 63% of fixed term contracts, and then it slowly decreases, as along the age brackets.
But perhaps something worth noticing. So notice 36 to 55 years of age. We're having 50 to 60% of all people who are in what would be termed like a mid-career stage, possibly, with some exception of early career researchers who are mature students, are actually people on short-term fixed-term contracts. So this is actually a very worrying trend, which speaks that it is like fixed-term contracts are not an early career phenomenon. And it can be partly explained, of course, with Germany, where getting a permanent contract is like a red herring. But beyond that, we're still speaking of a very, very huge precarity and insecurity when it comes to contracts.
Right. I mean, just remember the previous slide that only 49% in total of those employed in academia, have permanent contracts. So yeah, can we go to the next slide? So speaking of, there is a nicer map, and thanks to our designer, there is a much nicer map in the report itself. Here, what is missing is Russia, which has also very high prevalence. But if you can see, fixed-term contracts were very prevalent in Central Europe. So in German-speaking countries, including Switzerland, and in East Central Europe, so Poland, Czech Republic. And for other, we don't have enough data, because we could, just as I said, we could only make these kind of calculations, and Russia is missing there. Russia has also a very high prevalence of fixed-term contracts in our sample. So you should always remember that this is not necessarily generalizable to the state of academia. I mean, and we have reasons to assume that in some countries, certain people could be underrepresented in our survey. But as I say, I think this says something probably about EASA as a whole, about members from these countries. If you meet them, they are probably much more likely to be on fixed-term contracts than from other countries. Okay, next slide, please. If we look at permanent contracts, so from other way around, only 29% of respondents had permanent contracts. At 29% from the whole, right? So not from those employed of academia. 26% from the whole sample were on permanent and full-time contracts. So you can maybe assume that if this is again generalizable to EASA, that about a quarter of the people have relatively stable jobs when it comes to permanency and full-time employment. There is a correlation, as could have been expected, with seniority. So 90% of full professors have full-time contracts in our sample, or in comparison, let's say, with the earliest departmental position. So only 37% of assistant professors or lecturers would have such contracts. right? And then associate professors and readers come somewhere in between, and postdoctoral fellows, we don't have it here, have hardly any permanent contracts. I mean, okay, next slide. Right, and then we, if we just, so that, we saw that 26% of the whole sample, 29% of the whole sample had permanent contracts. When you focus on those 60% who think of themselves as employed in academia as primary status, 44% had permanent contracts. There were, I mean, you can see there were not huge gender differences. Men and women, who are the biggest gender segment in our sample, have about the same proportion, hold about the same proportion of permanent contracts in academia. Those who preferred not to declare their gender or identify in alternative non-binary way, we had to merge them in this case together. They have a slightly higher proportion, but that there is nothing we can conclude from it. Okay, next slide. Again, we looked at ERC countries for this for these purposes, and if you remember that 44% had permanent contracts in our sample as a whole, then you can see that when you go from German-speaking countries, including Switzerland, then you would have a very low proportion, about 17%. Right? You always look at the blue bar. Blue bar is not always, but blue bar is the general size, right? So you can actually see that in German-speaking countries it's very low. In UK and Ireland, which is another, about 15% of the sample, it's about 50-50. About 50% of researchers have permanent contracts. In Southeast Europe, for instance, it's very high. But here we can think of reasons for self-selection. I mean, on the one hand, EASA is not association of choice for most of the Southeast European ethnologists. And in our sample, we had only 27 to 34 cases, depending on, we had 27 cases, for instance, in this chart, but 37 overall. So yeah. There is nothing you can, again, the question of self-selection comes into it. But anyhow, what is important to see is that what is important to recognize is that there are great regional variations. Okay, next slide, please. Now, if you look at a person who might be holding an average, holding a permanent contract, a person on a permanent contract is probably statistically on average around 50 years old. It took him or her or them between PhD and the first permanent contract on average 5.3 years, right? So those who have gotten permanent contracts, remember it's only 29% of the sample, it took them on average 5.3 years. Again, there is a huge regional variation. In East Central Europe, it takes the longest. I mean, it took on average 7.4 years. Okay, can we get the next slide? I mean, that's going to show it, and you can see it here. I mean, and essentially, I think what you can conclude from it, and what we conclude is that problematic is the habilitation model of tenure track, or what is in Russia known as Dr. Nauk, or that used to be known. So in those countries where it still exists, like in Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and so on, obtaining a blending with the permanent contracts takes much longer after finishing one's PhD. Okay, next slide, please. So what about the views that people have? So we asked them just to see we asked those people who don't have permanent contracts. I mean, how in the survey of how they see their situation. I mean, would they want one or they wouldn't want one, and or so on. So if you look at question answer from the top, answer 3 and 4, I want one, but it's very unlikely, and I want one, but it's unlikely. So if you merge them together, 68% think that it's very unlikely that they will land with permanent post in next 5 years. What is very interesting, and this is something which we might, which is interesting to think in terms of generally education and how we approach anthropology, despite essentially negative outlook, only 4% are seriously scheming. Sorry, there is a typo. Scheming. I mean, are seriously thinking or planning to leave academia. So probably, people who are somewhere on a postdoc saying like, "Hey, I'll finish this and then I'll get out." It's something to bear in mind that most of the people who are EASA members are probably not very optimistic about their outlooks, but still holding on.
Maybe just a small intervention here. It's like we didn't ask people in permanent contracts, are they planning to leave academia? And secondly, we did make this survey in 2018, and I'm sure on this question, both groups might have quite different response now, especially with the pandemic and the way that universities have often dealt with it.
Right. I mean, and that was a problem. I mean, until now we thought that qualitative research was long, but quantitative research done by anthropologists also takes forever. So maybe it's not something about the type of research, but the type of people doing it. So anyhow, can we get the next slide, please? So we also inquired. About economic well-being and financial stability, and this is just an overview. The question, in fact, I mean, those graphs, I'll lead you through them. In the report itself, they are dividing into 6 sections. So people have to say, my income. How do you agree with the following statement? My income covers all my needs, and then it's completely, and then so there was 1, and then 2, and 3, 4, 5 to disagree completely, right? And then for the purposes of this presentation, I just split them into 3 parts. Somebody who would be on one side, 1 and 2 in the middle, and then on the other side. So first of all, first thing to note is that only 42 or almost 43% of respondents cover their living expenses solely from wages from one full-time job. So essentially, as wage earners or workers, as far as we go, we are not, our wages are not reaching any. What is the term? Any possible, it's not a family wage, let's say. It's not even a reproduction wage. 22% of non-students. So when we just then focus on those who are employed or those who are not students, 22% of non-students depended on support from partners, and 10% on their relatives. Earnings in general, when we compared, and there was a tricky question, so that one has to, and it's well explained in the report. We looked at people at the earnings level, at the earnings that people reported, and compare them to averages, OECD. Earnings as reported for the country, for a given country, for OECD. And what we found out that only in few countries, actually, in 8 countries out of 21 for which we had enough data, so only in 8 countries out of 21, earnings of anthropologists. So think of us as highly skilled professional, with a PhD. So only in 8 out of 21 countries, the incomes were above average, right? So so actually earnings are very low, and they are much, I mean, very, and in absolute values, not surprisingly, they're very low in southern Europe, is both in Western Europe, so like in Portugal and Spain, as well as in Southeastern Europe, Bulgaria, and then Eastern Europe, not surprisingly. So when it comes to this economic well-being, as you can see, my income covers all my needs. About 50% of the people said that they basically had more or less enough money to get them through the month, right? But worryingly, about quarter didn't have enough. They don't have income high enough to cover all their needs, and these are probably the people who depend on their partners and on their relatives. When it comes to saving rate, only something more than something below the third of anthropologists are capable of saving something from their salaries or from their income, and most of them, or not most of them, or the highest proportion, about 47%, are not able to manage a major unexpected expense. And here, what one could know that we don't know what had happened. I mean, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the data collected here comes before COVID, before all the lockdowns and so on. So we could imagine that those people who already could not save, and majority who could not manage a major unexpected expense are doing not very well, probably doing very badly, during this very major unexpected event, the pandemic. Okay. So next, do you want to add anything? No. Okay. So on the next slide, so this is
we have to.
Oh, so hurry up. Okay. Okay. So I'll just go through quickly through the next slide. I mean, this is something that you would recognize. There is a high proportion of structural overtime. So people report about that they are spending about 10% or more than 1 day of working on stuff which is required by their employees, but they are not being paid for it, right? Everybody works a lot. I mean, and actually permanent staff report in absolute values report higher structural overtime. But what is interesting is that there is a correlation between number of contracted hours and the size and the structural or an unpaid time. People who are contracted, for instance, who get this adjunct or sessional lecturers, so who are contracted to maybe teach one or a few courses, they get paid only for about 70% of their work time. Next slide, please. So these are major reasons for overtime. As you can see, I'm going from the bottom, writing grant applications of various sorts and advising students, and committee work are probably the biggest. I mean, some of the biggest reasons for overtime. Can we go to the next?
To say something, because advising students is part of the core activity of academics. Right. So which is teaching, research, and service, and we're seeing that things like writing grant proposals, which is not research, which is preparation, fundraising for research, is like taking enormous amounts of time. PR, which is not part of academic life, it should be part of like the rest of the university's life. Again, there is a kind of overtime that is completely not within the remit of the academic profession. That's
Yeah. I mean, and that's very important. I mean, because there is another. I mean, in the report itself. I mean, on top of it, I mean, these were just tasks that people were asked by their employers to do, right? I mean, you have to submit a funding application as a part of your postdoc or as a part of your position, or you have to fundraise for something, or you have to do a committee work. So these were tasks. So people work actually on average 10 hours extra a week on tasks required by the employer. So it's a value basically captured by the employer directly. Then there is on top of it, we also ask in our survey about so-called career development, tasks. So like, for instance, like writing this, writing this report or being active in EASA or networks or whatever, how much time people spend on other things. And then, so besides the stuff that your employer wants, there is also like the stuff that you are doing for the community. And we discuss it also in the report itself, right? But this one is only about structural overtime. Applying for funding, when we look at it very closely, I mean, only 10% of respondents did not write any funding applications in the preceding year, right? About 16%, which you see in the light blue, about 16% spent. I'm going to ignore that khaki yellow thing, because those are people who reported that fundraising is their primary job responsibility, right? But about 16% of the people spend more than 4 weeks to, somewhere between 1 month and 2 months writing funding applications, which is a huge amount of time. If you think about it, the year has only 12 months only. And if we made a very silly calculation where we sort of averaged it and so on, and we calculated that we had spent, I mean, it's a very speculative calculation, but it drives the point home that collectively respondents spent that year about 80,000 hours combined writing funding applications. When you extend it to EASA as such, EASA members in 2018 would have spent probably as much as 221,000 hours writing funding applications. So this is what academics now in Europe more or less do. Next slide. It's 35% or almost 36% applied for bigger projects. So I mean, that's how we think of it. So where you would be as PIs on projects which would include at least one another team member. So 1/3 of people are applying for these projects, and not surprisingly, and this is something which speaks about the life of professors these days. 60% of the people have written, 60% of full professors have written such funding applications in the previous year, in those 12 months. And if you think of it, that probably from other chunks, many of them are already working on some kind of a project because they are in their first year, second year, or fourth year, let's say. You can just imagine that the scope of project funding work that is being done, and how that is restructuring academia as a whole, and which is very important, that it's not an issue which is which is individual.
Just something to add here, and I'm very mindful of time, but so also think of this in many countries, including the UK, which is one of our big samples, like teaching fellows, instructors, research fellows, like postdocs are not entitled to apply for most of the big grants that are available in the country. And like this, they write grants not as PIs, which means that they haven't responded to this as I have written the grant. And sometimes they write the grant for those that are in the categories above them because they become the PIs on the grant. So this time that is spent sometimes is not necessarily the time spent by the PI themselves. Just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, and then the last 2 slides. So the last thing, please, next slide. The last issue I want to discuss, which I want to highlight in this presentation, is the question of discrimination, harassment, verbal or physical abuse, and unequal treatment at the workplace. So more than 53% of respondents had personally experienced some sort of discrimination or reported experiences some sort of discrimination, unfair treatment, harassment. That's a whole thing. Verbal and physical and emotional abuse. Women and those who self-described in non-binary ways reported experiences gender-based discrimination more often. Academics from working class backgrounds experienced unequal treatment to a disproportionately large degree. And it's worth pointing it out that this is that we have some data on class composition in our sample. Racial and ethnic discrimination, and this is what comes out from our research, we had about 1% of the people have reported racial or ethnic discrimination. And considering, I mean, if you imagine how EASA looks, considering how racially homogeneous your association still is, we can just surmise that it's probably that it actually, for the people whom it impacts, it might be it is probably a very big problem, which needs to be understood better, also in its local variations. The major other reason for discrimination or unequal treatment at the workplace had to do with the nature of academic hierarchies. Okay, can I have a next slide? So this last slide just says about, it's a summary of what kind of discrimination, harassment, abuse people have reported. Gender-based and citizenship and age were the highest, and that other, actually, most of that other, which is about 15%, has to do with academic hierarchy. And now Maria should wrap up. Next slide, please.
I guess just briefly, because you have probably read this, at least in the brief report, we're seeing anthropology in Europe as an increasingly precarious profession, with taking 5 or more years to get a permanent contract, and this chance decreasing over time. There is extremely large percent of number of hours that all EASA members spend on overtime and unpaid work. And a lot of this is taken by new funding projects or working on publications from past projects which don't pay you anymore, which is especially a big problem when you're on a fixed term contract. Then there is a question of increasing dissatisfaction of PhD students who are increasingly depending on their own spending and on parents' loans and partners to be supported, or work overtime to be supported through their studies, to be given money for fieldwork, money for conferences, and for any career development. So this is very worrying. And then despite the awareness and experiences of discrimination, there is growing understanding that unions, academic and others, are not adequately responding to this crisis in the profession. Last slide, please. So the report comes with some suggestions which are maybe sometimes sound a bit outside of the report's remit, but at the same time we've actually worked them through examples from other also countries, from some suggestions, like for instance having an Athena swan-like monitoring of employment practices and allowing precarious fixed-term contract workers into permanent positions as something that institutions can do, and also monitoring of the Vitae research career framework and its application. So this is absolutely vital. And for now, it's just wishful thinking, and there are no mechanisms for reinforcement, but there should be, and it should be probably financially binding. Then the other thing is that we should really start speaking about the cutting of cyclical project funding and overtime workloads on funding applications. And there should be a debate, widely speaking, in the sector, and I think among anthropologists as well, about how grants are given, especially, how much longer term actual research programs. And in the case of anthropologists, it is vital to be able to go to your field every year and so forth. How this funding is enabled rather than constrained, because cyclical project funding constrains this kind of ability. Then, and this is now a debate that has just been started by a new campaign in the in UCU, which is the biggest academic union, well, probably in Europe, but in the UK for sure, which covers the whole sector, about the fact that PhD programs should not be like student programs, but should be programs that give a salary, that give benefits. And in the case of anthropology, we should really insist that that includes fieldwork, conference and career development money. That's part of the package. And then professional organizations and learning societies as EASA, even if they were not designed for that, are currently also involved in this crisis and should increasingly engage in lobbying activities and introducing standards of good practices to be observed by institutions that adhere to our professional values. And those who don't should be sanctioned. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the debate. Next slide, which is the questions for you that we have. Oh, there was one more slide, wasn't there? But it's a slide for the audience, or we can maybe just ask these questions either way. What happens?
Hi,
David, was there one more slide? It was the slide that we wanted to place up for the discussion.
I'm asking James if he can bring it back up again, because I assumed that was the last slide. So
yeah, I said last slide because it was the last slide that I want to speak about. But generally, I can say what was the questions are. Oh yeah. Great. Just the very bottom slide. Yeah. So, you know, how to identify like which questions you find important or which redundant. Some of this, I guess, we know. The depressing is how much of this we already know, I guess. The question of how do we put the recommendations and how do we use the report on different scales, you know, EU, national, institutional, and how do we adapt this approach also, which is not unknown as workers' inquiry, to the national scale or institutional scale. What can EASA do? And also, you know, can we think of what ways can we disseminate the results that could reach ears that could listen? And that's guys, I guess it. If you have something about Precantro to say as well, but that's maybe a different discussion. Thank you for your attention.
great, thank you very much, Anne-Marie and Martin. It was a really clear and detailed presentation, and I think the detail really does matter. So we have these questions, and what we'll do is we will probably take these questions off the podium so that we can bring other people up to comment. So just you know, so you can remember. So what are these recommendations you think are important? How do they scale across nation and region? And what should we do next as an exec? Because I think, you know, people should probably be aware that there's a new elections for the next exec. We don't want this to be dropped. We want this to carry on. And certainly we are involved in European-wide associations like EASA, which lobbies. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can promote this and ensure that this conversation gets carried on. But I'm going to take those questions off, and I'm going to invite some questions. There's one question from